When my father got sick, the first person who showed up at the hospital wasn't my mother. It was her. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in a modest beige cardigan, holding a flask of soup like she belonged there. She said his name softly, Rafiq, as if she'd been calling it for years. My mother froze at the door, clutching her purse so tight her knuckles turned white. And I, standing between them, felt the air thicken, the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. I didn't know her name then, not yet. But I knew the look on my mother's face. It was the same one she wore the night she found lipstick on my father's collar 20 years ago. That's how this story begins, in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and guilt. My name is Zara, and I grew up believing that family meant loyalty, that a husband was supposed to protect, a wife was supposed to forgive, and a daughter was supposed to hold everything together. For most of my life, that's what I tried to do. My parents had been married for 35 years. My mother Selma was the quiet type, gentle voice, always home-cooked meals, ironed shirts. My father Rafiq was the kind of man everyone admired from a distance, charming, generous, the one who never missed Friday prayers but also never came home on time. When I was 12, I learned to stop asking why. He'd stay out late, claiming business dinners or car trouble. My mother would sit in the living room, pretending to watch the news while her tea went cold. Sometimes she'd whisper a prayer, sometimes she'd hum an old ghazal. I used to think she didn't care. Later, I understood, she just couldn't break. Years passed, I got married, had my own children, moved to another city. My father's shadow still lingered, the smell of his aftershave, the sound of his deep laugh whenever he told a story about the good old days. But after my mother's silence grew too heavy, I started keeping my distance. Then, 2 months ago, I got a call from my cousin. "Your father's been admitted. Heart issue. You should come." When I arrived, he was lying on a hospital bed, half awake, tubes running from his arm. My mother sat by his side, eyes swollen from crying. And then, that woman, the one with the soup, walked in. She didn't flinch when my mother looked at her. She simply placed the flask on the bedside table and said, "He hasn't eaten properly in days." It was such a simple sentence, but the intimacy behind it burned like acid. "Who are you?" I asked. She turned to me, calm but defiant. "I'm someone who cares about him," she said. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out without another word. That night, my mother stayed in my guest room, staring at the wall. "She's been around for years," she said finally. "Since before you left for college. I thought she'd disappear once he got older." Her voice trembled, but he always finds his way back to her. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that we'd handle it. But deep down, I felt something else, rage. Rage that this woman had the audacity to show up when my mother was still the legal wife. Rage that my father had humiliated her. Again. When my father was discharged, the doctor gave clear instructions. He'd need constant care for at least a week, help with meals, medicine, movement. My mother, frail from her own health issues, couldn't manage it alone. That's when I made the decision. A foolish one, maybe. But it felt righteous in the moment. If she's so eager to play caregiver, I said, then let her do it properly. Let her see what real responsibility feels like. My mother looked up, uncertain. "Zara, you can't." But I was already on the phone, calling the woman whose number I'd found scribbled on one of my father's old notepads. "Hello? It's Zara," I said, "Rafiq's daughter. The hospital released him today. He needs someone to stay with him around the clock for a week. Since you're involved, maybe you should be the one to do it." There was a pause. Then, a quiet sigh. "If that's what he needs." I didn't expect her to agree, so part of me wanted her to refuse to reveal that her affection was just an act. But she didn't. She arrived the next morning, suitcase in hand, face calm as ever. The house was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan and my father's shallow breathing. I stood by the doorway as she unpacked her things neatly, deliberately into the guest room. She didn't glance at me once. "Don't get comfortable," I said. It's just 1 week. She smiled faintly. I know. Her name, I learned, was Sumina. She spoke softly, moved gently. She made my father porridge and spoon-fed him like he was a child. It infuriated me. My mother refused to come by during that week. I can't bear to see her in my home, she said. You just keep an eye on things. So I did. Every day I drove there after work, checked his vitals, made sure Samina wasn't doing anything out of line. But she never argued, never snapped back. She just cared. Too calmly. And that calmness unnerved me more than anger ever could. By the third day, curiosity got the better of me. I started noticing little things. A photo frame turned face down on the nightstand. A separate drawer she'd locked in the kitchen. Envelopes with unfamiliar handwriting. Once, when she left for groceries, I peeked into her room. Her clothes were neatly folded. Her toiletries lined up with precision. On the nightstand sat a worn leather folder. I knew I shouldn't, but I opened it. Inside were medical forms, utility bills, and a marriage certificate. My throat went dry as I read the names. Rafiq Ahmed and Samina Begum. Date, 12 years ago. 12 years. That was after I'd already moved out. After he and my mother had renewed their vows for their 30th anniversary. After all the nights my mother had waited up for him. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hands, feeling the world tilt beneath me. He hadn't just betrayed my mother. He'd erased her. I heard the front door open. Samina's voice floated in. Zara, are you here? I slid the folder shut, heart pounding. When she entered the room, her eyes landed on it instantly. You shouldn't be looking through my things, she said quietly. Why? I snapped, afraid of what I'd find. She didn't answer. She just looked. Tired. Your father didn't mean to hurt anyone, she said softly. He just wanted peace in his last years. Peace. I could barely contain myself. He married you while still with my mother. That's not peace, that's cowardice. For the first time, her calm cracked. She took a shaky breath. He told me he'd divorced her, that she agreed. It was a lie, a clean, cruel lie. And in that moment, I realized we were both victims of the same man. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan hummed above me like a restless thought I couldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that piece of paper, the marriage certificate, its edges worn, ink slightly smudged from fingerprints. Proof, not just of betrayal, but of something worse, a secret life built on my mother's silence. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. My father was still asleep. Samina was preparing his breakfast like nothing had changed. She moved quietly, flipping the paratha, placing sliced fruit on a tray. I watched her hands, steady, practiced, affectionate, and something inside me twisted. How long had she done this for him? How many mornings had she woken up beside the man who'd left my mother lonely for decades? I wanted to hate her, but all I felt was exhaustion. Why didn't you ever tell us? I asked finally. She froze for a moment before turning around. Tell you what? That you married him, I said, pushing the folder across the table. Don't bother denying it. I saw the certificate. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Then she sat down opposite me, folding her hands in her lap. I didn't tell you, she said quietly, because I thought you already knew. Knew. My mother doesn't even know. She looked down at her hands. Rafiq said he'd divorced her years ago, that she wanted to move on. He told me you'd both accepted it. I laughed bitterly. Do I look like someone who accepted that? He's been living in the same house with my mother. Do you realize what you've done? She didn't respond. Her eyes glistened, but she kept her voice even. I loved him, she said softly. Maybe that was my mistake. But I believed him. The sound of footsteps interrupted us. My father appeared at the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was pale, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were still the same. What's going on here? He asked, voice rasping. I stood up, the anger I'd been holding back boiling over. You tell me, I said. Are you going to explain why this woman has a marriage certificate with your name on it? His expression didn't change much, just a flicker. A tiny muscle twitched near his jaw. He glanced at Samina, then at me. I told you before, he said slowly. Your mother and I had differences. Differences. I could hear my voice rising. You mean you married someone else while she was still your wife? That's not a difference, Abu. That's betrayal. He coughed, a harsh, dry sound. You don't understand adult matters, Zara. I understand enough, I snapped. I understand that you lied to both of them. That you let Amy sit alone for years while you built a whole other life. Samina looked away. He sat down heavily in a chair, exhaling. It wasn't supposed to be this way, he muttered. I waited for more. For remorse. For anything. But it never came. That evening, I drove to my mother's house. She was sitting on the balcony, watering her plants, pretending not to notice how her hands shook. Amy, I said softly, kneeling beside her. There's something you need to know. She didn't look up. If it's about that woman, I don't want to hear it. It's not just about her, I said. It's about Abu. He married her. The watering can slipped from her hand, hitting the tiled floor with a dull thud. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she whispered, What did you say? He married her 12 years ago. I saw the papers. Her lips trembled, but her eyes stayed dry, too dry. He told me he was helping her, she said faintly, that she was alone, and he was just being kind. Amy, I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Her shoulders began to shake, but no tears came. Just small, broken gasps that sounded like the remains of a heart trying to stay whole. I spent my life defending him, she said. To my family, to the neighbors, to you. Every rumor, every whisper, I told them he was a good man. Her voice hardened. And all this time, he was someone else's husband. For the next 2 days, I stayed with her. We didn't talk much. She moved through the house like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, performing small rituals of normalcy, while her eyes looked somewhere far away. Meanwhile, my father's condition worsened. The doctor called to say he wasn't responding well to treatment, that stress might accelerate things. I went back, torn between duty and disgust. When I arrived, Samina was sitting by his bedside, reading aloud from a small Quran. The light from the lamp fell softly on both their faces, hers calm, his frail but peaceful. For a fleeting second, they looked like a couple who'd shared a lifetime together. And maybe they had. In their own secret, stolen way. Zara, she said when she saw me. He's asking for your mother. I hesitated. After everything he's done. She nodded. He said he wants to see her one last time. I didn't know whether to call it guilt or desperation. Maybe it was both. But I called my mother anyway. The next morning, she came. Dressed in a pale blue shawl, her posture straight, her face composed the kind of quiet strength that comes after years of endurance. When she entered the room, my father's eyes filled with tears. He tried to reach for her hand, but she didn't move closer. I wanted to tell you, he whispered. I wanted to make it right. She shook her head slowly. You wanted peace for yourself, Rafiq, not for me. Silence stretched between them, years of silence, distilled into that one heavy moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. You broke your promise to me, she said, voice steady. But I will not let your sin break our daughter. And with that, she turned and walked out. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. Later that night, when I checked on him, he was asleep. Samina was sitting quietly by the window, a cup of tea untouched beside her. I didn't come here to ruin your mother's life, she said without looking at me. I just wanted to care for him. That's all I ever wanted. I believed her. Maybe that was the hardest part, realizing she, too, had built her world on lies she didn't create. When I left the house that night, I stood outside for a long time, looking up at the windows where both women had loved the same man, one in silence, the other in secrecy. And I thought to myself, sometimes, betrayal doesn't come in one act. It comes in years of pretending everything's fine. It was 2 weeks later when I got the call. My father had passed away in his sleep. No final words. No apology. Just silence, the same silence he'd used to build his walls of deception. When I reached his house, Samina was sitting in the living room, surrounded by papers, photos, and memories she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen but dry. There were no dramatic tears, just exhaustion, the kind that lives in the bones. "He wanted to be buried next to your mother," she whispered. I froze. "He doesn't deserve that." "I know," she said quietly. "But he asked me to tell you." And her. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at 2 envelopes the lawyer had given me, one addressed to my mother, the other to me. My hands trembled as I opened mine. Inside was a short letter, written in my father's familiar handwriting. "Zara, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I know you hate me, maybe you should. But I need you to understand something before you decide who I was. Your mother and I had broken long before I met Simana. She was kind to me when no one else was. I married her not out of betrayal, but out of loneliness. I thought I could keep both worlds from collapsing, but I ended up breaking them both. Take care of your mother, and don't hate Samina. She only loved me the way your mother once did. Abu." The letter fell from my hands. It wasn't enough. Not after years of lies, not after watching my mother's heart shatter in silence. But somehow, those last lines, "Don't hate Samina," stayed with me. The funeral was small. My mother didn't speak a word the entire time. She stood a few feet away, her face unreadable, the wind tugging gently at her shawl. Samina stood at the other end, far, quiet, invisible to most of the relatives who didn't even know who she was. When the prayers ended, people began to leave, whispering half-formed gossip as they walked away. Only we 3 remained, the wife who was betrayed, the wife who never knew she wasn't supposed to be one, and the daughter caught between them. My mother turned to me. "Take her home," she said softly. I blinked. "Who?" "Samina. She has no one else, does she?" Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired. It wasn't forgiveness, it was release. That evening, I drove Samina home. The car was quiet for most of the ride. Only when we reached her gate did she finally speak. "I know your mother hates me," she said, her voice small. "And maybe she should. But I never wanted to take her place." I looked at her, the lines of grief etched around her eyes, the way she clutched the edge of her dupatta, like it was the only thing holding her together. "You didn't take her place," I said softly. "He just gave you both the same lie." She gave a faint, sad smile. "Maybe that's true. But he loved you, Zara. Don't forget that." I didn't answer, because I didn't know if love could still mean something when it came with betrayal attached. Weeks passed. My mother and I started sorting through my father's things, old photographs, watches, notes, dusty trophies from a life he'd lived in fragments. One afternoon, I found a small, locked box in his bedside drawer. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some addressed to my mother, some to some each one told a story of guilt, fear, and confusion. He wrote to my mother about missing her smile, her cooking, her patience. He wrote to Samina about peace, companionship, and gratitude. He'd tried to belong to both worlds and ended up belonging to none. When I showed them to my mother, she read a few quietly, then placed them back in the box. "He couldn't choose," she said, and that was his punishment. Months later, life began to find its rhythm again. The grief turned from sharp pain into a dull ache, something you learn to carry, like an old scar that doesn't quite fade. One afternoon, my mother came to me while I was working in the garden. "I'm thinking of visiting Samina," she said. I looked up, surprised. "Why?" She sighed. "Because she lost him too, and maybe that's enough punishment for all of us." The visit was awkward at first, polite, cautious, filled with pauses, too heavy for words. But by the time my mother stood to leave, she said something unexpected. "You took care of him when I couldn't," she told Samina. "For that, thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the beginning of peace. Later that evening, I walked along the same hospital corridor where this whole story had started. The same smell of antiseptic, the same flickering lights, but everything felt different now. I wasn't the same daughter who came here out of anger. I stopped by the small window that overlooked the courtyard. The wind rustled the trees gently calm, almost forgiving. Maybe that's what time does. It doesn't erase the truth. It just softens the edges. That night, I visited my father's grave alone. I placed 2 white roses, one from my mother, one from C. Different women, same pain. Different lives, same loss. I stood there for a long time, thinking about how complicated love can be, how it can build and destroy, heal and wound, all at once. Before leaving, I whispered, "You were a coward, Abu, but you were also human. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us are." Sometimes, truth doesn't destroy families, silence does. We keep secrets thinking they'll protect the ones we love. But secrets don't protect, they poison slowly. And by the time we tell the truth, it's already too late to undo the damage. A story about love, betrayal, and the cost of silence.